The autumn wind of 1838 carried the scent of dying leaves and desperation through the streets of Millerville, Georgia. In the town square, beneath the shadow of a gnarled oak tree that had witnessed more sorrow than celebration, a crowd gathered. Around a makeshift wooden platform, the auctioneer's voice boomed across the assembled faces, some curious, some hungry, all complicit in the machinery of human bondage that churned relentlessly through the American South. But this was no ordinary auction day. This was the aftermath of the Cherokee removal, when the federal government's greed had torn families from their ancestral lands and scattered them like seeds on barren ground. What remained were the broken pieces, people reduced to property, sold to the highest bidder to satisfy debts, taxes, and the insatiable appetite of a system that measured worth in dollars rather than dignity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Among the crowd stood Eleanor Whitmore, a woman whose circumstances had brought her to this place of moral compromise. At 32, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that spoke of better days, auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun, green eyes that had once sparkled with hope, but now held the dull sheen of survival. Her black dress, worn and mended in places, marked her as a widow still in mourning. Though her husband James had been dead for 8 months now, the dress was also the only decent garment she owned. Eleanor clutched a small, leather purse against her chest, its contents weighing far less than the burden in her heart. Inside lay $1.50, every penny she possessed in the world. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd come to an auction where human beings were sold like livestock, carrying barely enough money to buy a decent meal. But Eleanor wasn't here by choice. She was here because the bank had given her 30 days to settle James's debts or lose the farm that had been in his family for 3 generations. She was here because the cotton crop had failed 2 years running, and the creditors circled like vultures. She was here because sometimes desperation makes philosophers of us all, forcing us to question everything we thought we knew about right and wrong. The auctioneer, a round man named Silas Goodwin, whose belly strained against his vest, called for attention. "Next item," he announced, consulting a grimy ledger. Cherokee male, approximately 25 years of age. Strong back, good teeth, suitable for field work or skilled labor. Eleanor's breath caught as 2 men dragged a figure onto the platform. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark skin gleaming with sweat despite the cool October air. Iron shackles bound his wrists and ankles, connected by a chain that limited his movements to short, shuffling steps. But it was the burlap hood covering his head that made Eleanor's stomach turn, a deliberate cruelty designed to strip away the last vestige of human dignity. "Starting bid is $50, Goodwin called out. A voice from the crowd shouted. 40, 35, called another. Eleanor watched in horror as the bidding descended rather than climbed. This wasn't the frenzied competition she'd expected. The man on the platform wasn't drawing premium prices. Something was wrong. "What's the matter with him?" a farmer near Eleanor asked his companion. "Word is he's been trouble," came the reply. "Tried to escape twice. Beat a overseer half to death with his bare hands. They say he's got a temper that makes him more dangerous than useful." "Cherokee too," the farmer spat. "They're supposed to be gone, all of them. Don't know why anyone would want the headache." The bidding stalled at $20. Goodwin looked frustrated, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "Come now, gentlemen, this is prime stock we're talking about. Look at those shoulders, that build. $20 is robbery." But the crowd seemed uninterested. Eleanor could feel their collective mood. They wanted compliant workers, not potential rebels. The hooded figure on the platform represented risk, uncertainty, possible violence. In a world where control was everything, such unknowns were unwelcome. $15, someone finally called, but half-heartedly. 12, Came another bid, clearly hoping to steal a bargain. Eleanor found herself studying the man more closely. Even through the hood, she could sense something about his posture, not broken, despite the chains. Not defeated, despite the circumstances. There was a dignity in the way he held himself, a refusal to bow completely, even in this most degrading of situations. She thought of James, dead these 8 months from a fever that had burned through him like wildfire. In his final delirium, he'd spoken of honor, of doing right by people regardless of their station. "Eleanor," he'd whispered with his last coherent breath, "promise me you'll remember that every soul has worth. Promise me you won't let this world make you hard." The promise had seemed easy then, meaningless almost, spoken to a dying man who wouldn't be around to see whether she kept it. But now, watching the human being auctioned like a piece of furniture, the words echoed in her mind with uncomfortable clarity. $10. The bid came from a thin man in a patched coat, and that's generous for damaged goods. Goodwin's face flushed red. "Gentlemen, this is ridiculous. I've got paperwork showing this man built half the houses in Cherokee County before the removal. He's skilled labor, not just field hands. Skilled at causing trouble." Someone muttered. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. The same feeling she'd had the morning James died, when she'd realized that grief and fear and love could all exist in the same space without canceling each other out. She thought about the farm, about the debt, about the impossible situation that had brought her here. 30 days to find money she didn't have, to save a property she couldn't work alone. The land needed someone strong enough to clear the back 40, skilled enough to repair the barn roof that had been leaking since spring, determined enough to help her salvage something from the wreckage of her life. $8, called the thin man. Final offer. Goodwin looked around desperately. Anyone else? "This is highway robbery at $8. The crowd remained silent. Eleanor could feel the moments slipping away, could sense the auctioneer's growing frustration. In a few seconds, the man would be sold to someone who saw him as nothing more than a problem to be managed, a potential source of profit despite the risks. She thought about James's promise again, about worth and dignity and the choices that define us when everything else falls away. Eleanor raised her hand. $1.50, she called out, her voice smaller than she'd intended, but clear enough to carry across the square. The crowd turned to stare at her. Someone laughed, not unkindly, but with the sort of amusement reserved for obvious mistakes. Goodwin squinted in her direction, clearly uncertain whether she was serious. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "the current bid is $8. "I heard," Eleanor replied, louder this time. "I'm bidding $1.50. More laughter from the crowd. The thin man who'd bid $8 looked annoyed rather than amused. "You can't bid lower than the current offer, lady. That's not how auctions work." But Goodwin held up a hand for silence. His eyes had sharpened, taking in Eleanor's appearance, her obvious poverty, the desperate edge in her voice. He was a man who made his living reading people, understanding their motivations and limitations. "The lady makes a point," he said slowly. "Current bid is $8, but we seem to have reached an impasse. Perhaps we should consider alternative arrangements." The thin man stepped forward. "Now wait just a minute. I bid $8 fair and square." "You did indeed, Mr. Carver," Goodwin replied. "But auctions require willing buyers, and it seems the market has concerns about this particular lot. Perhaps we should explore creative solutions." Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She was operating on pure instinct now, driven by forces she didn't fully understand. "I can offer $1.50, she repeated. "It's all I have." "What makes you think you can handle him?" Carver demanded. "You're just a woman, and a grieving widow at that. This one's dangerous." "Maybe," Eleanor said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. But dangerous doesn't always mean evil. Sometimes it just means desperate, the crowd murmured at this. Several men exchanged glances. Eleanor could feel their judgment, their assumption that grief had addled her thinking. Perhaps it had. Perhaps this was the most foolish thing she'd ever done. But as she looked at the hooded figure on the platform, still standing straight despite everything, she felt something she hadn't experienced since James's death, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Goodwin consulted his ledger again, then looked out at the crowd. "Gentlemen, we have an unusual situation. Mr. Carver has bid $8 for what appears to be a problematic acquisition. Mrs. Whitmore has bid $1.50 for the same. Given the concerns about this lot's temperament and the limited interest shown, I'm inclined to consider both offers." "That's not legal," Carver protested. "What's legal," Goodwin replied carefully, "is the auctioneer's discretion in unusual circumstances. This Cherokee has already cost the county money in guards and restraints. The quicker we resolve this matter, the better for everyone involved." Eleanor stepped forward, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. "Sir, I know my bid is low. But I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not afraid of troubled people. Sometimes troubled people just need someone to see them as human." The words came out before she could stop them, hanging in the air like a challenge. The crowd fell silent, perhaps recognizing something in her tone that went beyond desperation into the realm of conviction. Goodwin studied her for a long moment. Then he looked at Carver, who was growing red-faced with indignation. Finally, his gaze returned to the hooded figure on the platform. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly, "are you prepared to take full responsibility for this individual? Understanding that any trouble he causes, any damage he does, any attempts at escape, all of that falls on your head?" Eleanor's mouth went dry. She thought about the farm, about the debts, about the impossible task of rebuilding a life from nothing. Then she thought about James's promise, about worth and dignity, and the kind of person she wanted to be when the world stripped everything else away. "Yes," she said, "I am." Goodwin raised his gavel. The crowd held its breath. Even Carver seemed frozen, perhaps unable to believe what was happening. "Sold," Goodwin announced, bringing the gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed across the square like a gunshot. "To Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore for $1.50. Eleanor felt her knees nearly give out. She'd done it somehow, impossibly she'd done it. But as the reality of her situation began to sink in, as she realized she'd just purchased a human being with her last $1.50, the magnitude of her decision hit her like a physical blow. What had she done? What on earth had she done? The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads in amazement, others muttering about foolish women and poor decisions. Carver stomped away, clearly disgusted by the entire proceedings. Eleanor stood frozen in place, clutching her now empty purse, watching as two guards began to lead the hooded man down from the platform. "Ma'am?" Goodwin approached her with a ledger and a pen. "I'll need you to sign the papers and provide payment." Eleanor nodded numbly, scrawling her name where indicated and emptying her purse of its meager contents. The coins felt heavier than they should, each one representing not just money but choices, commitments, promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "He's your responsibility now," Goodwin said, pocketing the money. "Good luck to you, Mrs. Whitmore. You're going to need it." As the guards brought the chained man toward her, Eleanor felt the weight of every eye in the square. Some looked at her with pity, others with judgment, a few with something that might have been respect. But it was the hooded figure himself who commanded her attention, still silent, still dignified despite everything, waiting to see what this strange turn of fate would bring. For the first time since James's death, Eleanor Whitmore had made a choice that felt like more than just survival. Whether it was the right choice remained to be seen. But as she looked at the man she'd just purchased for everything she owned, she felt something stir in her chest that had been absent for months. Hope, terrifying, Impossible, necessary hope. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wagon Eleanor had borrowed from her neighbor Samuel Tucker creaked along the rutted dirt road leading away from Millerville, each pothole sending jolts through the wooden seat that seemed to echo the uncertainty hammering in her chest. Behind her, secured with additional rope that the sheriff had insisted upon, sat the Cherokee man she'd purchased with her last coins. The burlap hood still covered his head, a condition the authorities had maintained for everyone's safety during transport. Eleanor gripped the reins with white knuckles, her mind racing faster than the old mare pulling them could ever manage. The reality of what she'd done was settling in like winter frost, cold and avoidable. She'd bought a human being. The moral weight of that transaction pressed down on her shoulders, heavier than any physical burden she'd ever carried. But what choice had she really had? The bank note in her pocket, creased from repeated folding and reading, spelled out her situation in unforgiving black ink. 30 days to produce $147, or watch James's family farm disappear into the hands of strangers. The mathematical impossibility of earning such a sum through her own labor had driven her to this desperate gamble. The Cherokee man hadn't spoken a single word since leaving the auction square. Eleanor found herself stealing glances at him in the wagon's side mirror, trying to read something from his posture, his breathing, the way he held his chained hands. He sat perfectly still despite the wagon's constant motion, as if he'd learned to find stability within himself when the world around him offered none. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she said finally, her voice sounding strange in the autumn air. "I suppose you should know that, seeing as how ... Well, seeing as how things are." Silence. She tried again. "I know this situation isn't. It's not what either of us would choose. But maybe we can figure out how to make it work for both of us." Still nothing. Eleanor bit her lip, wondering if he even spoke English. The auction paperwork had listed his name simply as Cherokee Joe, obviously not his real name, but rather the sort of dismissive label white authorities assigned to people whose actual identities they couldn't be bothered to learn or pronounce. Road wound through a landscape painted in the deep golds and crimsons of late October. Ordinarily, Eleanor would have found beauty in the scenery, but today the dying leaves seemed ominous, reminders of endings and the harsh winter that lay ahead. How would she feed 2 people through the cold months? How would she heat the farmhouse? With no money for firewood, how would she manage any of this? As they crested a small hill, the Whitmore farm came into view below them. Eleanor's heart clenched at the sight. Even from a distance, she could see the signs of neglect that had accumulated since James's death. The barn's roof sagged visibly, where several boards had worked loose. Weeds had overtaken what should have been the vegetable garden. The fence around the chicken coop, listed at dangerous angles, held upright more by habit than structural integrity, thought it was still beautiful. Though the farmhouse itself was solid, built by James's grandfather from heart pine that would outlast them all. The well was good and deep, the soil rich when properly tended. 80 acres of possibility, if only she could find a way to unlock it. Eleanor guided the wagon down the winding path to the farmyard, noting how the Cherokee man's posture changed as they approached the buildings. She couldn't see his face, but something in the way he tilted his head suggested he was evaluating what he saw, cataloging problems, perhaps, or calculating escape routes. "This is it," she said, pulling the mare to a stop near the front porch. "This is home, or, well, it will be, if we can figure out how to save it." She climbed down from the wagon seat, her legs unsteady after the hour-long ride. The afternoon sun slanted low across the farmyard, casting long shadows that made everything look larger and more mysterious than it actually was. Eleanor walked around to the back of the wagon, her heart pounding as she faced the question she'd been avoiding. What exactly did she do now? The Cherokee man sat motionless, still hooded, still chained. The rope securing him to the wagon could be untied easily enough, but then what? The shackles on his wrists and ankles weren't something she could remove without proper tools. Did she even want to remove them? The authorities had made it clear they considered him dangerous. But looking at him now, Eleanor found it hard to reconcile the warnings with the reality before her. Yes, he was large and powerfully built. Yes, the auction papers had mentioned violence. But there was something about his stillness that spoke. More of dignity than menace, more of patience than barely contained rage. "I'm going to untie the rope," she said aloud, as much to prepare herself as to inform him. "I need you to understand something, though. I can't afford to have you run away. Not because I think of you as property," she added quickly, "but because if you disappear, they'll blame me. They'll say I helped you escape, and then we'll both be in more trouble than we can handle." She waited for some response, some acknowledgement, that he'd heard and understood. When none came, she reached for the rope knots anyway. Her fingers fumbled with the hemp fibers, made clumsy by nervousness and the weight of the moment. "I know you probably think I'm just another white woman who sees you as something to be owned," Eleanor continued, working at the knots. "And maybe you're right. Maybe I don't understand anything about what you've been through or what this means to you. But I want you to know that I didn't buy you because I wanted a slave. I bought you because I was desperate, and because something about the way you carried yourself made me think maybe you were desperate too." The rope came free. The Cherokee man made no move to leap from the wagon or attack her or do any of the things the auction crowd had warned about. He simply sat there waiting. Eleanor stepped back, giving him space. "Can you ... would you be willing to come inside? I'd like to remove that hood, if you'll let me. And maybe we can talk about how this might work." For the first time since leaving the auction, the man moved. He turned his hooded head toward her, and though she couldn't see his expression, Eleanor felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. Then, slowly and carefully, he shifted toward the edge of the wagon. The chains made the process awkward. He had to work his legs over the side one at a time, the metal links rattling with each movement. When he finally stood on the ground, Eleanor was struck again by his size. He towered over her 5'4" frame, broad enough that his shadow seemed to swallow her whole, but he made no threatening moves. Instead, he stood perfectly still, waiting for her next instruction or decision. The passivity was almost more unnerving than aggression would have been. It suggested a level of resignation that spoke to experiences Eleanor could barely imagine. "This way," she said softly. Gesturing toward the farmhouse porch. They walked across the farmyard in strange procession, Eleanor leading, the Cherokee man following with his shuffling, chain-shortened steps. The front door stuck when she tried to open it, swollen from recent rains and her own inability to plane it properly. She had to put her shoulder into it, and when it finally gave way, she stumbled slightly into the front room. The house felt cold and empty, filled with the particular silence that accumulates in places where laughter used to live. Eleanor's few pieces of furniture sat draped in dust cloths, and the air carried the musty smell of a home that hadn't been properly aired in too long. She'd been living mostly in the kitchen and her bedroom, unable to bear the memories that lurked in every other corner. "Please, sit down," Eleanor said, indicating the sturdy wooden chair near the fireplace that had been James's favorite. "I'm going to build up the fire, and then we need to talk." The Cherokee man moved to the chair and settled into it, the chains creating a soft metallic whisper with each movement. Eleanor busied herself with kindling and newspaper, grateful for a task that allowed her to avoid direct eye contact while she gathered her courage for what came next. When the fire began to catch and throw warm light across the room, she finally turned to face him fully. "I'd like to remove the hood now, if that's all right with you. I think it's time we saw each other properly." She approached slowly, watching for any sign of resistance or alarm. When she reached toward the burlap covering, his head, her hands were trembling slightly. The fabric was rough under her fingers, secured with a simple drawstring around his neck. "Hold still," she murmured, working at the knot. "Almost got it." The string came loose, and Eleanor carefully lifted the hood away, the face revealed beneath. Took her breath away, not because it was threatening or cruel, as she'd half expected, but because it was so utterly human. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, with strong, angular features and skin the color of burnished copper. His black hair was longer than white men typically wore theirs, reaching nearly to his shoulders despite obvious attempts to cut it shorter. But it was his eyes that stopped her, cold dark brown, intelligent, and filled with a weariness that seemed far older than his years. Those eyes studied her with equal intensity, taking in her face, her worn dress, the nervous way she clasped her hands in front of her. Eleanor felt exposed under that gaze, as if he could see straight through to all her doubts and fears and desperate hopes. "My God," she whispered, not meaning to speak aloud. "They had you hooded like you were some kind of animal." For the first time since the auction, he spoke. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, accented but clear. "In their eyes, that's exactly what I am." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She sank into the chair across from him, suddenly understanding the full magnitude of what she'd purchased, not just a person's labor, but their suffering, their history, their complete dehumanization by a system that treated people like livestock. "What's your real name?" she asked softly. He was quiet for so long that Eleanor wondered if he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of all the losses that couldn't be undone. "Sequoia Henderson," he said. "My Cherokee name is longer, but that's what your people can pronounce." "Sequoia," Eleanor repeated, tasting the unfamiliar syllables. "Like the man who created the Cherokee writing system?" Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, that she knew such a thing. "My grandfather chose it," he said simply. Eleanor nodded, filing away this small piece of information like a treasure. A real name, a family history, a connection to something larger than the degrading circumstances that had brought them together. "Sequoia," she said again, wanting to use it, to acknowledge him as a person rather than property. "I need you to know something. I didn't buy you because I believe in slavery. I bought you because I'm about to lose everything, and I thought maybe we could help each other." He leaned back in the chair, the chains across his chest catching the firelight. "Help each other how?" Eleanor took a deep breath. This was the conversation she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The moment when she had to explain her impossible plan to a man who had every reason to distrust her completely. "I owe the bank $147, she began. "If I can't pay it in 29 days, they take the farm. I can't earn that kind of money on my own, but this land could support us both if we can make it productive." Again, Sequoia's expression remained carefully neutral. "And what makes you think I would help you save a farm that I'll never own?" It was a fair question, one that cut straight to the heart of the moral contradiction Eleanor was trying to navigate. How could she ask someone she technically owned to work toward saving something that would never belong to him? "Because," she said slowly, working out the words as she spoke them, "maybe ownership isn't the only thing that matters. Maybe having a place where you're treated with dignity, where you have enough to eat and a warm place to sleep, and someone who sees you as human, maybe that's worth something too." Sequoia studied her for a long moment. "And when the farm is saved, when the debt is paid, what happens to me then?" Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She'd been so focused on the immediate crisis that she hadn't fully considered the long-term implications of what she'd done. "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't thought that far ahead. But I promise you this, I won't sell you to someone else. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Eleanor watched Sequoia's face, trying to read the calculations happening behind those dark eyes. He was weighing risks, evaluating options, trying to determine whether her promises held any weight or were just the empty words of another white person who would disappoint him in the end. Finally he spoke. "Show me the farm," he said. "Show me what needs to be done. Then we'll see if your offer is real or just guilt trying to dress itself up as kindness." Eleanor felt a surge of something that might have been relief or might have been terror. She'd made her proposal, and he hadn't rejected it outright. But now came the hard part, proving that her words meant something, that together they might actually have a chance of saving what seemed unsaveable. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the farmyard in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Tonight they both had to live with the choices that had brought them to this moment and the uncertainty of everything that lay ahead. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Whitmore farm, frost painting delicate patterns on the windows that would melt away within hours. Eleanor had barely slept, her mind churning through doubts and possibilities in equal measure. She'd made coffee. Before sunrise, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd been drinking for months, using beans she'd been saving for a special occasion. If this wasn't special, she didn't know what was. Sequoia had spent the night in the small room off the kitchen that James used to call his study. Eleanor had offered him the guest bedroom upstairs, but he declined with a shake of his head that suggested he understood the precarious nature of their arrangement. Better to stay close to the exits, his choice seemed to say. Better to avoid any appearance of presumption. She'd given him a key to the shackles. The decision had come to her sometime around midnight. As she lay staring at the ceiling and thinking about dignity, trust, and the impossibility of building anything real on a foundation of chains. The key had been included with the auction paperwork, standard procedure. The sheriff had explained, in case of medical emergencies. Eleanor had sat at her kitchen table in the lamplight, turning the small piece of metal over in her fingers, before finally placing it on the floor outside Sequoia's door. This morning, she could hear him moving around in the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes being handled with care. When she emerged from her bedroom, fully dressed despite the early hour, she found him sitting at the small wooden table. The shackles lay neatly folded beside his coffee cup like shed skin. "Thank you," he said simply, meeting her eyes. Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The sight of him without chains was somehow more powerful than she'd expected, as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time. He wore the same rough clothes from yesterday, but without the metal bonds. He looked less like a prisoner and more like a man who'd simply had a very hard night. "Are you ready to see what we're dealing with?" she asked, wrapping her hands around her own coffee cup for warmth. "I've been ready since before sunrise," Sequoia replied. "I walked the perimeter while you were sleeping. Hope you don't mind." Eleanor felt a flutter of something, not quite fear, but awareness. He could have kept walking, could have disappeared into the woods and been miles away before she even knew he was gone. Instead, he'd chosen to return, to honor the fragile agreement they'd sketched out the night before. "What did you see?" she asked. Sequoia stood and moved to the window, gesturing toward the farmyard. 40 acres of good bottomland, mostly cleared. 20 acres of pasture that could support cattle if properly fenced. 15 acres of woodland that needs selective cutting. 5 acres around the house and outbuildings. Eleanor joined him at the window, impressed despite herself. She'd lived here for 3 years as James's wife, but Sequoia had cataloged the property's potential with the practiced eye of someone who understood land in ways she was only beginning to learn. The barn roof needs immediate attention, he continued. 3 boards completely rotted through, 7 more that won't last the winter. The chicken coop is a loss, better to tear it down and start fresh. The well housing is solid, but the pulley system needs rebuilding. What about the fields? Eleanor asked. The cotton crop failed 2 years running. Sequoia shook his head. Cotton's the wrong crop for this soil. Too much clay, not enough drainage. This land wants corn, beans, maybe tobacco if you can get the seeds. Food crops that'll feed people instead of making rich men richer. Eleanor stared at him. How do you know all this? My people have been farming this region for 1,000 years, Sequoia said quietly. We knew which crops would thrive and which would struggle long before your people arrived. Cherokee County wasn't named for its scenic beauty. The casual reference to your people stung, but Eleanor recognized the truth in it. She was part of a system that had displaced his family, destroyed his community, reduced him to property at an auction block. The fact that she felt uncomfortable with that reality didn't change it. Will you teach me? She asked. Sequoia turned from the window to study her face. You're serious about this partnership? Dead serious, Eleanor replied. I know I don't have any right to ask for your help. I know the whole situation is wrong in ways I probably don't even understand. But I also know that I can't save this place alone, and you can't gain your freedom while chained to someone else's failure. Freedom, Sequoia repeated, tasting the word. What makes you think that's what I want? The question caught Eleanor off guard. Doesn't everyone want freedom? I had freedom once, Sequoia said. Had a wife, a home, children. Had respect in my community and skills that people valued. Freedom didn't protect any of that when the soldiers came. He paused, looking back out at the frost-covered fields. Maybe what I want now isn't freedom. Maybe it's purpose. Eleanor felt something shift in her understanding. She'd been thinking about their arrangement in terms of her desperation and his captivity. But perhaps that wasn't the whole story. Perhaps he had his own reasons for choosing to stay, reasons that went beyond simple survival. Show me, she said. Show me what you see when you look at this land. They spent the next hour walking the property together, Sequoia pointing out details that Eleanor had never noticed despite living there for years. He showed her where the natural drainage patterns would carry spring runoff, where the soil composition changed from field to field, where the tree line could be selectively thinned to open up new growing areas without destroying the windbreak that protected the farmhouse. Here, he said, kneeling in what had been James's failed cotton field. He scooped up a handful of dirt and crumbled it between his fingers. See how the soil holds together, but doesn't clump. Good for corn. Planted in rows running north-south. Leave space for beans to climb the stalks. The beans will fix nitrogen in the soil, make everything grow better. Eleanor knelt beside him, trying to see what he saw in the dark earth. How long would it take? To convert the fields, I mean. For corn? Plant in spring, harvest in late summer. But we'd need to prepare the ground this fall. Get the soil ready for winter. It's almost November now, not much time. What about money? Eleanor asked. Seed costs, supplies, everything we'd need to get started. Sequoia was quiet for a moment. There are ways to get by without much cash, if you're willing to work and trade for what you need. Cherokee learned that lesson the hard way. They continued walking, moving through the pasture where a few scraggly cattle grazed on whatever grass they could find. The fence posts leaned at dangerous angles, and several sections of rail had fallen completely. These cattle, Sequoia said, studying the small herd. How many head? 12, Eleanor replied. They belong to James. I've been letting them fend for themselves mostly, just trying to keep them alive through winter. They're underfed but healthy, Sequoia observed. Good breeding stock if properly managed. But they need better pasture, better shelter. Eleanor followed his gaze to the ramshackle lean-to that served as the cattle's winter shelter. It looked ready to collapse at the first strong wind. I know it's all falling apart, she said. I know I've let things go. After James died, I didn't know how to do any of this on my own. You weren't on your own by choice, Sequoia. sighed. There's a difference. Something in his tone made Eleanor look at him more carefully. What happened to your family? She asked softly. During the removal, I mean. Sequoia's expression closed off, but not before she caught a glimpse of pain so raw it made her chest ache. They didn't survive the journey, he said simply. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't bring them back, Sequoia replied, but without harshness. Sorry doesn't change what happened. But maybe ... He paused, looking around at the farm with its mixture of potential and decay. Maybe something good can still grow from broken ground. They walked back toward the farmhouse in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Eleanor found herself seeing the property differently now, through Sequoia's eyes. What had looked like overwhelming problems an hour ago now seemed like challenges with potential solutions. Difficult, certainly, but not impossible. As they approached the front porch, the sound of hoofbeats on the road made them both turn. A horse and rider were approaching at a steady clip, dust rising from the dried mud ruts. Eleanor felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Visitors rarely brought good news to struggling farms. The rider was Samuel Tucker, her neighbor who'd lent her the wagon for yesterday's trip to town. Sam was a decent man, a few years older than Eleanor, who'd been trying to court her in his awkward, well-meaning way since James's funeral. His intentions were good, but his timing was terrible. "Morning, Eleanor," Sam called as he dismounted. Near the front steps, his eyes immediately fixed on Sequoia, taking in his size, his obvious Cherokee features, the absence of any restraints. "Heard you had some excitement at the auction yesterday." "News travels fast," Eleanor replied carefully. Sam's expression grew troubled. "Eleanor, what were you thinking? Folks are saying you bought yourself a Cherokee, spent your last dollar on him. People are worried about you." "People need to mind their own business," Eleanor said, more sharply than she'd intended. "Now, Eleanor, you know I'm only saying this because I care about you," Sam continued, his voice taking on the patient tone men used when they thought women were being unreasonable. "This isn't safe. You're out here alone with a savage who—" "His name is Sequoia Henderson," Eleanor interrupted. "And he's not a savage. He's a human being who's been treated worse than an animal, and he knows more about farming than both of us put together." Sam's face flushed red. "Eleanor, you're not thinking clearly. Grief can make people do foolish things. But it's not too late to fix this. I could take him off your hands, find him a proper situation where he'd be supervised." "No." The word came out harder than Eleanor had intended, but she didn't soften it. "This is my farm, my decision, my responsibility." "Your responsibility?" Sam's voice rose. "Eleanor, you bought a man like he was a piece of equipment. How is that responsible?" The accusation hit home because it contained enough truth to hurt. Eleanor had bought Sequoia, no matter how she tried to justify it or dress it up with talk of partnership and mutual benefit. The legal reality was unchanged by her good intentions. But before she could respond, Sequoia stepped forward. "Mr. Tucker, is it?" he said, his voice calm and respectful. "I appreciate your concern for Mrs. Whitmore's welfare, but I think you should know that she removed my chains voluntarily, fed me at her own table, and offered me terms that no other white person has ever considered. If you're worried about her safety, maybe you should be asking why she felt the need to take such desperate measures in the first place." Sam's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. He clearly hadn't expected the Cherokee man to speak so eloquently, to turn the conversation back on him with such quiet dignity. That's not the point," Sam stammered. "The point is that decent people don't buy other people, regardless of the circumstances." "You're right," Sequoia agreed. "Decent people don't. But desperate people sometimes do desperate things. The question is what happens next." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward Sequoia for defending her. even though she wasn't sure she deserved it. "Sam," she said, trying to keep her voice level, "I know you mean well, but this is my choice to make. If you can't respect that, then maybe you should leave." Sam looked between them, his expression cycling through confusion, frustration, and something that might have been hurt. "Fine," he said finally. "But when this goes wrong, and it will go wrong, Eleanor, don't come crying to me for help." He mounted his horse with more force than necessary and rode away without looking back. Eleanor watched him go, feeling a mixture of relief and regret. Sam was a good man, but his view of the world didn't leave room for the kind of complexity she was trying to navigate. "You didn't have to defend me," she said to Sequoia. "Yes, I did," he replied. "If we're going to make this work, people need to see that you're not just another white woman with a pet savage. They need to see that you're someone worth respecting." Eleanor looked at him, struck again by his intelligence, his understanding of the delicate social dynamics they were both navigating. "And if they don't? If the whole community turns against us?" Sequoia smiled for the first time since she'd met him, a small, sad expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Then we'll learn to depend on each other instead of depending on them. Sometimes that's the only way forward." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Eleanor realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer owner and property, or even desperate strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were partners in an enterprise that neither could accomplish alone, bound together by necessity, but also by something deeper, a shared understanding that sometimes the only way to save what matters is to risk everything for people who might not deserve it. The work ahead would be hard, harder than anything Eleanor had ever attempted. But for the first time since James's death, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. 3 weeks had passed since the auction, and the Whitmore farm hummed with activity that hadn't been seen since before James's death. Eleanor found herself waking before dawn, not from anxiety, but from anticipation, eager to see what progress Sequoia had made on whichever project he'd tackled the day before. The transformation was remarkable. The barn roof now stood solid and weather-tight, shingled with split cedar that Sequoia had crafted from fallen trees on the back 40. The new chicken coop, built from salvaged lumber and positioned to catch the morning sun while staying protected from winter winds, housed a small flock of hens Eleanor had traded for with vegetables from the kitchen garden. Sequoia had helped her establish, but it was the smaller changes that spoke most powerfully to Eleanor. The way Sequoia had reinforced the front porch steps without being asked, the careful repairs to the window frames that now opened and closed smoothly, the ingenious system of rain gutters he'd fashioned to channel water into barrels for the dry spells that would inevitably come. This morning, Eleanor found him in the workshop he'd claimed in the barn's far corner, bent over a piece of wood with tools he'd somehow crafted from scrap metal and broken implements. The smell of wood shavings and honest sweat filled the air, along with something else, the scent of purpose, of a man using skills that had been forced into dormancy, but never truly forgotten. "What are you making?" Eleanor asked, approaching his workbench with the careful respect she'd learned to show for his projects. He never minded her questions, but he worked with a concentration that deserved not to be casually interrupted. "Door," Sequoia replied without looking up from his work. "For the root cellar. The old one's rotted through, letting in moisture and vermin. Winter's coming, you'll need a proper place to store vegetables, preserved meat, anything that needs to stay cool and dry." Eleanor nodded, though she privately wondered where the preserved meat would come from. Their current diet consisted mainly of vegetables from the garden, eggs from the new chickens, and whatever game Sequoia could catch with snares he'd constructed from materials she couldn't identify. Somehow, though, they never seemed to go hungry. His knowledge of which wild plants could supplement their meals, which roots could be ground into flour, which berries could be dried for winter sustenance, seemed limitless. "May I watch?" she asked, Sequoia glanced up, seeming to consider the request. Over the weeks, they developed an easy working relationship, but Eleanor sensed there were still boundaries. He maintained spaces in his mind and heart that remained carefully guarded. She never pushed, understanding instinctively that trust built slowly, like the careful layers of a well-constructed wall. "Hand me that chisel," he said finally, nodding toward a tool that looked nothing like any chisel Eleanor had ever seen. Upon closer inspection, she realized he'd fashioned it from a broken plow blade, heating and reshaping the metal with techniques that seemed to come from some deep well of inherited knowledge. Eleanor passed him the tool and perched on a nearby stool, content to watch him work. His hands moved with practiced economy, each cut deliberate and precise. There was something almost meditative about watching skilled craftsmanship, the way his breathing stayed steady, the way he seemed to listen to the wood itself, working with its grain rather than against it. "Where did you learn carpentry?" she asked softly. "My grandfather," Sequoia replied, not pausing in his work. "He built houses for Cherokee families, but also for white settlers who knew quality work when they saw it. Taught me that trees have their own wisdom. You just have to be patient enough to learn what they want to become." Eleanor thought about that, the idea that materials might have their own intentions, their own natural purposes that skilled hands could discover and honor. It seemed to align with everything she'd observed about Sequoia's approach to the farm. He didn't impose solutions. He found them, as if they'd been waiting there all along. "What was your grandfather's name?" she asked. Sequoia's hands stilled for a moment. Eleanor worried she'd overstepped, ventured into territory he wasn't ready to share. But then he resumed his cutting, his voice taking on a different quality, softer, more distant. "Atsila," he said. "It means fire in Cherokee. He was named for the color of his hair when he was young, red like autumn leaves, my grandmother used to say. He lived to be nearly 80, survived 2 forced relocations before the final one." Sequoia paused. "He didn't survive the Trail of Tears." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. She'd heard the phrase Trail of Tears, but only in abstract terms, as a historical event that had happened to other people in other places. Sitting here with Sequoia, watching him shape wood with tools his grandfather had taught him to make, the reality of it became personal, immediate, devastating. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing the words were inadequate, but needing to say them anyway. "He was proud of his work," Sequoia continued, as if he needed to finish the story now that he'd started it. "Even when white officials told him he couldn't build houses anymore, couldn't own property, couldn't practice Cherokee law, he kept working. Said as long as his hands could hold tools, part of our people would survive. Is that why you—" Eleanor gestured around the workshop at the evidence of his skilled craftsmanship. "Partly," Sequoia admitted, "but also because building things is the only way I know to make sense of a world that keeps tearing everything down." They worked in comfortable silence after that, Eleanor holding boards steady while Sequoia measured and cut, occasionally asking for different tools or materials. The root cellar door took shape under his hands, like something that had always existed, just waiting for someone skilled enough to reveal it. Around midday, Eleanor went to the house to prepare lunch, a simple meal of cornbread, preserved vegetables, and wild greens that Sequoia had shown her how to identify and prepare. When she returned to the workshop, she found him standing motionless at the workbench, holding a small carved figure in his palm. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, setting down the lunch tray. Sequoia looked up, seeming almost surprised to find her there. "Habit," he said, showing her the carving. "When I was a child, my grandfather taught me to carve small animals from wood scraps. Said it was good practice for the hands, good exercise for the patience. I haven't made one since." Eleanor looked at the figure more closely. It was a bird, a cardinal, she thought, carved with exquisite detail from a piece of red cedar. The wood seemed to glow in the afternoon light, filtering through the barn's open doors, and she could see individual feathers etched into the surface with minute precision. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "You made this just now?" "While I was getting lunch?" Sequoia nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Carved it without thinking. Muscle memory, I suppose. But I made it for—" He paused, seeming to struggle with something internal. "I used to make them for my daughter. She collected them, lined them up on a shelf in our cabin. Cardinals were her favorites because they stayed through winter when other birds flew south." Eleanor felt her breath catch. This was the first time Sequoia had mentioned his daughter specifically, and the pain in his voice was almost unbearable to witness. "How old was she?" Eleanor asked gently. 7, Sequoia replied. "Old enough to help with the corn harvest. Young enough to still believe her father could protect her from anything." His fingers closed around the carved bird. "Her name was Ayana. It means eternal blossom." Eleanor sat down heavily on the stool, overwhelmed by the weight of what he'd shared. She tried to imagine losing a child, tried to comprehend the kind of grief that would follow someone for years, but her mind shied away from the enormity of it. What happened to her? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Fever," Sequoia said simply. "Halfway through the forced march, no medicine, no clean water, no shelter. She lasted longer than many, but—" He shrugged, a gesture that somehow contained more sorrow than any tears could have conveyed. "Winter doesn't care how young you are or how much your father loves you." Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "Sequoia, I don't know what to say. I can't imagine." "Don't," he said, but not harshly. "Don't try to imagine it. It's not something that should be imagined by people who don't have to live it." They sat in silence for several minutes, the carved cardinal resting in Sequoia's palm like a small prayer. Eleanor found herself thinking about loss, about the different ways grief could break a person or reshape them into something stronger and more purposeful. "Is that why you stayed?" she asked finally. "Here with me? Because it reminds you of building things with your grandfather?" Sequoia considered the question seriously. "Partly," he said, "but also because you looked at me like I was still human. After everything that happened, after all the ways I've been diminished and degraded, you saw something worth saving." He looked directly at her. "That's a rare gift, Eleanor. Rarer than you probably realize." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not sure I deserve that much credit. I was desperate. I needed help and you were available," Sequoia finished. "I know, but desperation could have led you to see me as just a tool, just a means to solve your problems. Instead, you gave me back my name, my choices, my dignity. That's not desperation. That's character." They resumed eating lunch, but the conversation had shifted something between them. Eleanor found herself thinking about James, about the promises she'd made to her dying husband about seeing worth in every person. For months after his death, those promises had seemed like abstract ideals, impossible to maintain in a world that demanded practical compromises. But here was Sequoia, carving birds for a daughter who would never see them, building structures that would outlast both of them, choosing to invest his considerable skills in the future of a woman who legally owned him, but treated him as an equal. His presence was proof that ideals could survive even the worst circumstances, that dignity could persist even in the face of systematic dehumanization. "Sequoia," Eleanor said, setting down her cornbread, "I want you to know something. Whatever happens with the farm, whatever the future brings, you've already given me more than I gave you. You've reminded me who I want to be." Sequoia looked at her for a long moment, then carefully placed the carved cardinal on the workbench between them. "Keep it," he said, "for when winter comes and you need reminding that some things endure." Eleanor picked up the small figure, feeling the smooth wood warm under her fingers. It was more than a carving. It was a gift that contained memory, loss, hope, and the kind of trust that had to be earned over time through consistent action. That evening, As they worked together to finish the root cellar door, Eleanor found herself planning not just for the coming winter, but for the spring that would follow. They were building more than functional structures. They were building a life together, founded on mutual respect and the kind of partnership that transcended the legal documents that had brought them together. Outside, the first frost of the season painted the windows silver, but inside the workshop, warmed by their shared labor and growing friendship, Eleanor felt safer and more hopeful than she had since James's death. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they would face them together, not as owner and property, but as two people who had found in each other the strength to keep building when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-November, carried by a postal rider who seemed eager to complete his delivery and move on. Eleanor found it slipped under her door when she went out to collect eggs from the chicken coop. The envelope bearing the official seal of Millerville Bank and Trust. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal, though she already knew what the contents would reveal. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. This correspondence serves as final notice regarding the outstanding debt of $147 owed on the property known as the Whitmore Farm. Payment in full is required by December 1st, 1838. Failure to satisfy this obligation will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings and forfeiture of all assets. Your attention to this matter is required. Respectfully, Harrison Blackwood, President, Millerville Bank and Trust. 11 days. Eleanor sank onto the front porch steps, the letter fluttering in her grip as a cold November wind swept across the farmyard. 11 days to produce a sum of money that might as well have been $11,000 for all the likelihood she had of obtaining it. Sequoia emerged from the barn, carrying the morning's milk from their single cow, another recent addition to the farm's modest livestock. He took one look at Eleanor's face and set the milk pail down carefully before approaching. "Bad news?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Eleanor handed him the letter without speaking. She watched his dark eyes scan the formal language, his expression growing more thoughtful with each line. When he finished reading, he folded the paper carefully and handed it back to her. 11 days, he said simply. "I knew this was coming," Eleanor replied, her voice hollow. "I've known since the day I bought you that we were working against an impossible deadline. But somehow, watching you fix everything, seeing the farm come back to life, I started to believe we might actually have a chance." Sequoia settled beside her on the steps, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the crisp morning air. "Tell me about the debt," he said. "How did it get so large?" Eleanor had been dreading this conversation, though she'd known it would have to come eventually. The shame of her financial situation had been eating at her for months, made worse by the knowledge that much of it could have been avoided with better judgment and less trust in the wrong people. "James was a good farmer," she began slowly, "but he wasn't a good businessman. 3 years ago, a man named Morrison came through town selling what he called miracle cotton seeds, a new variety that was supposed to triple yields and resist disease." Eleanor laughed bitterly. James mortgaged the farm to buy enough seeds for all 80 acres. $47, which seemed like a fortune at the time. Sequoia listened without judgment, his attention focused entirely on her words. "The seeds were worthless," Eleanor continued. "Not just ordinary cotton, they were diseased, contaminated with some kind of blight that spread to neighboring farms. We lost everything that year, and the debt started accumulating interest." She paused, remembering the weight of that first failed harvest, the look of defeat in James's eyes. "The next year, we tried again with regular seeds, but the blight had infected the soil. Another complete loss." "What about other crops?" Sequoia asked. "Surely the bank would have accepted payment in corn, vegetables, anything that could be sold." Eleanor shook her head. "The mortgage specified cotton. The bank wouldn't renegotiate, said a contract was a contract. James got desperate, took out additional loans to buy fertilizer, to hire extra hands for the harvest. He was convinced he could make the land productive again through sheer force of will. But the soil was telling him something different, Sequoia observed quietly. Exactly, Eleanor said, surprised by his insight. You would have known immediately that cotton was wrong for this land. But James ... He was so focused on paying off the debt, so determined to save the farm, that he couldn't see any other options. When the fever took him last winter, we owed $147 plus accumulated interest. Sequoia was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the fields they'd worked so hard to restore over the past month. Eleanor could almost see his mind working, calculating possibilities, weighing options against the harsh reality of their timeline. There's something else, Eleanor said reluctantly. Something I haven't told you about why the bank is pushing so hard for foreclosure. Sequoia turned to look at her, his expression patient but alert. Harrison Blackwood, the bank president, Eleanor continued. He's been pressuring me to sell since James died. Not just for the debt, but because he has a buyer lined up. Someone who wants to buy up all the small farms in this area for some kind of development project. Who's the buyer? Sequoia asked, though his tone suggested he might already suspect the answer. Eleanor felt her stomach clench. Marcus Crenshaw. He owns the textile mill in Millerville, plus half the businesses in town. Word is he wants to expand his operations. Turn this whole valley into factory land. Sequoia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I know that name. You do? Crenshaw was one of the main advocates for Cherokee removal in this region, Sequoia said, his voice carefully controlled. He lobbied the state government, claimed Cherokee land ownership was preventing economic development. He made a fortune buying up confiscated Cherokee properties at auction for pennies on the dollar. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November morning. He's the one who... Your family's land? Among others, Sequoia confirmed. Crenshaw's mill was built on the site of a Cherokee village. The machinery sits where my cousin's house used to stand. He paused, his hands clenching into fists before he deliberately relaxed them. 63 families lost their homes, too. Make room for his expansion. Many of those families ended up on the Trail of Tears. The full scope of their situation began to crystallize in Eleanor's mind. This wasn't just about her farm, her debt, her personal struggle to survive. They were caught in a much larger web of greed and displacement, part of a pattern that had been repeating itself across the South for decades. So even if we somehow managed to pay off the debt, Eleanor said slowly, Crenshaw would probably find another way to force me out. Probably, Sequoia agreed. Men like him don't give up easily when they want something. Eleanor felt despair settle over her like a heavy blanket. Then what's the point? Why are we working so hard to save something that's already lost? Sequoia stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the barn he'd repaired, the chicken coop he'd built, the fields he'd helped her understand in new ways. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet intensity that made Eleanor look up. My grandfather used to tell a story about a Cherokee farmer whose fields were threatened by a terrible drought, Sequoia said. Every day, the man carried water from a distant stream to keep his crops alive, even though everyone told him it was hopeless. His neighbors said he was wasting his time, that the drought would kill everything anyway. Eleanor waited for him to continue. The rains never came that year, Sequoia went on. The farmer lost most of his crops, just like his neighbors predicted. But he saved enough to feed his family through winter, and he saved the seeds to plant again the next spring. When people asked him why he'd worked so hard for such a small result, he said, I didn't do it because I knew I would succeed. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because doing the right thing is its own reward. Eleanor felt something stir in her chest, not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. You think we should keep fighting, even knowing we'll probably lose? I think, Sequoia said, turning back to face her, "that we should fight because it's who we are, not because of what we might win or lose. You didn't buy me at that auction because you thought it would solve your problems. You did it because something inside you couldn't bear to watch another human being be degraded and discarded." Eleanor thought about that moment in the town square, about the impulse that had driven her to raise her hand and bid her last $1.50. He was right. It hadn't been a calculated decision based on potential benefits. It had been an act of recognition, of seeing dignity where others saw only risk and trouble. "Besides," Sequoia added with the faintest hint of a smile, "we have 11 days. A lot can happen in 11 days. "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked. "I mean that Crenshaw and the bank are expecting you to give up, to accept defeat gracefully, like a proper grieving widow should." Sequoia's expression grew more determined. "But they don't know what you're capable of when you have the right partner. They don't know what Cherokee ingenuity combined with frontier determination can accomplish." Eleanor felt a spark of curiosity kindle. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that this farm has resources they don't know about, value they can't see because they're only looking at cotton yields and mortgage payments." Sequoia gestured toward the woodlands at the property's edge. "I'm thinking that 11 days might be enough time to show them they've underestimated us." "Sequoia, we can't produce $147 in 11 days, Eleanor said. "Even if we sold everything we own, the cattle, the chickens, every tool and piece of furniture, we wouldn't come close." "You're thinking like they want you to think," Sequoia replied. "Like money is the only form of value that matters. But what if we could show them something worth more than money? What if we could demonstrate that this farm has potential they never imagined?" Eleanor looked at him skeptically. "What kind of potential?" "The kind that turns enemies into allies," Sequoia said cryptically. "The kind that makes people want to invest in success rather than profit from failure." Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road. 3 riders were coming up the lane at a steady pace, their faces grim and purposeful. Eleanor's heart sank as she recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Davidson, flanked by 2 men she didn't know, but whose official bearing suggested they weren't here for a social call. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sheriff Davidson called as they reached the farmyard, "I need to speak with you about your situation." Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirts and trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Good morning, Sheriff. What can I do for you?" Davidson dismounted, his eyes flicking nervously between Eleanor and Sequoia. "Ma'am, I've had reports of concerns about your arrangement here. Folks are worried about safety, about proper supervision of your employee. His name is Sequoia Henderson," Eleanor said firmly. "And he's been nothing but helpful and respectful since he's been here." "Be that as it may," Davidson continued, "I've got orders from the county to conduct a welfare inspection. Make sure everything appropriate." One of the other men, a thin fellow with pale eyes and an official badge, stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Inspector Coleman from the county office. We'll need to examine your premises and interview both you and your Cherokee to ensure compliance with territorial regulations regarding the supervision of displaced persons." Eleanor felt Sequoia tense beside her, though his expression remained carefully neutral. She realized that their peaceful month of rebuilding in partnership was about to be put to its most serious test. The outside world, with all its prejudices and legal complications, had finally caught up with them. "Of course," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt, "we have nothing to hide." But as the 3 officials began their inspection, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this visit was about more than simple welfare concerns. Someone had sent these men, someone who wanted to disrupt what she and Sequoia had built together. And with only 11 days left before the foreclosure deadline, she wondered if they would have any farm left to fight for once this inspection was complete. Inspector Coleman's examination of the farm was thorough and invasive. poking into every corner of Eleanor's life with the cold efficiency of a man who had performed such inspections many times before. He measured the distance between Eleanor's bedroom and the room where Sequoia slept, questioned the arrangement of their meals, and documented every improvement Sequoia had made with suspicious detail. "Explain to me again why your Cherokee is not properly restrained," Coleman said, consulting his ledger as they stood in the workshop. "County regulations require that displaced persons remain secured when not under direct supervision." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "His name is Sequoia Henderson, and he's been nothing but trustworthy. He's worked harder than any hired hand I've ever seen, and he's never given me reason to." "Mrs. Whitmore," Coleman interrupted, his voice taking on the patronizing tone Eleanor had come to despise. "I understand that grief can cloud judgment, but regulations exist for everyone's protection. Unsupervised Cherokee have been known to steal livestock, damage property, even assault their owners." "I am not his owner," Eleanor said sharply. "We have a working arrangement." Sheriff Davidson shifted uncomfortably. "Eleanor, you know I don't like interfering in folks' business, but there have been complaints. People are concerned about what goes on out here." "What kind of complaints?" Eleanor demanded. Coleman consulted his notes. "Reports of the Cherokee moving freely about the property without restraints. Claims that he's been seen handling tools and weapons without proper supervision. Concerns about improper relations between you and your property." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "That's a disgusting accusation. Sequoia and I maintain entirely appropriate. The problem," Coleman continued relentlessly, "is that appearances matter. A widow living alone with an unrestrained Cherokee male creates opportunities for scandal, regardless of actual behavior. For your own reputation, Mrs. Whitmore, supervision needs to be reestablished." Throughout this exchange, Sequoia had remained silent, standing with the controlled stillness Eleanor had learned to recognize as his way of managing anger. But when Coleman pulled a set of iron shackles from his saddlebag, something changed in Sequoia's expression. "That won't be necessary," Eleanor said quickly, stepping between Coleman and Sequoia. "I'm afraid it's not optional," Coleman replied. "Either proper restraints are maintained, or the Cherokee will be relocated to a facility where appropriate supervision can be guaranteed." "What kind of facility?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. "The Territorial Prison in Augusta has a work program for displaced Cherokee," Coleman said matter-of-factly. "Hard labor, but it keeps them occupied and properly supervised." Eleanor felt her world tilt. A month ago, she'd been a desperate widow facing impossible debt. Now she was standing in her own farmyard, watching officials threaten to drag away the person who had become her closest friend and strongest ally. The speed of the escalation left her dizzy. "How long would this relocation last?" she asked. Coleman shrugged. "Indefinitely. Until the Cherokee's status can be properly reviewed and permanent arrangements made." Eleanor understood the euphemism. Sequoia would disappear into the prison system, and she would never see him again. All his skills, his knowledge, his quiet strength, it would all be wasted on pointless labor designed to break rather than build. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sheriff Davidson said gently, "maybe this is for the best. You've got your own problems to worry about. What with the bank breathing down your neck, might be easier to focus on saving your farm without additional complications." Eleanor looked at Davidson sharply. "How do you know about the bank situation?" Davidson's face flushed slightly. "Well, news travels fast in a small town. People are concerned about your welfare, that's all." But Eleanor was beginning to see the larger picture. The timing of this inspection, coming so close to her foreclosure deadline, wasn't coincidental. Someone had orchestrated this, someone who wanted to ensure she faced the bank's ultimatum alone and unprepared. "Sheriff," Eleanor said slowly, "who exactly filed these complaints about my arrangement with Sequoia?" Davidson looked uncomfortable. Now, Eleanor, I can't reveal specific names. Complaints are confidential to protect Marcus Crenshaw, Sequoia said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken since the officials arrived. All three men turned to stare at him. Coleman's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. The Cherokee will remain silent unless directly questioned, Coleman snapped. It was Crenshaw, wasn't it? Sequoia continued, ignoring the inspector's command. He's been watching this farm, waiting for the right moment to eliminate any obstacles to his acquisition plans. Eleanor felt pieces clicking into place. That's why the timing is so convenient. Remove you from the farm. Leave me isolated and overwhelmed. Make sure I can't possibly meet the bank's deadline. Coleman's expression had grown cold. Cherokee, you will be silent, or you will be gagged. No, Eleanor said firmly. This is my property, and Sequoia has every right to speak in his own defense. Actually, Coleman replied with a thin smile, he has no rights at all. Cherokee are considered displaced persons without legal standing in territorial courts. They cannot testify, cannot bring complaints, cannot even speak in their own defense without permission from their legal guardian. Eleanor felt sick. The legal system had been designed to ensure that people like Sequoia remained voiceless, powerless, invisible. Even when they were clearly victims of larger conspiracies, they had no recourse, no protection, no way to fight back. I won't let you take him, Eleanor said. I'm afraid you don't have a choice, Coleman replied. The Cherokee will be relocated. For everyone's safety and welfare. Whose safety? Eleanor demanded. He's never hurt anyone. He's improved this farm beyond recognition, worked harder than any man in the county. What safety concern could possibly justify the safety of a grieving widow who clearly isn't thinking rationally? Coleman interrupted. Mrs. Whitmore, your judgment has been compromised by your circumstances. That's understandable, but it's also dangerous. The Cherokee will be removed for your own protection. Eleanor realized with growing horror that her own supposed welfare was being used as justification for destroying the one partnership that had given her hope. In the name of protecting her, they were taking away her strongest ally and closest friend. What if I refuse? Eleanor asked. Coleman's smile grew wider. Then you'll be charged with obstruction of territorial justice and conspiracy to harbor a fugitive. The Cherokee's failure to report for proper supervision technically makes him a runaway, and anyone who aids a runaway Cherokee faces serious criminal penalties. The trap was perfect. Submit to having Sequoia removed or face criminal charges that would ensure she lost the farm anyway. Either way, Crenshaw would get what he wanted, Eleanor isolated, defeated, and ready to surrender her property without further resistance. But as Eleanor looked at Sequoia, she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not fear or resignation, but calculation. His dark eyes moved between the three officials, cataloging details, assessing weaknesses, formulating some kind of plan. Inspector Coleman, Sequoia said, his voice carefully respectful, might I request a brief moment to gather my personal belongings before the relocation? Coleman looked suspicious. What personal belongings? Cherokee property was confiscated during removal. Items I've made during my time here, Sequoia explained. Tools, small carvings. Nothing of significant value, but they hold personal meaning. Eleanor wondered what he was planning. Sequoia owned almost nothing beyond the clothes on his back and the tools he'd crafted. But something in his tone suggested this request wasn't as simple as it appeared. 5 minutes, Coleman said reluctantly. Under supervision. Sequoia nodded and headed toward the workshop, with Coleman following close behind. Eleanor found herself alone with Sheriff Davidson, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. Sheriff, Eleanor said quietly, you've known me since I married James. Do you really think I'm a danger to myself or anyone else? Davidson sighed heavily. Eleanor, it's not about what I think. Orders came down from the county, and I've got to follow them. But between you and me, I think this whole thing stinks. Problem is, I can't prove anything, and I can't ignore official complaints. Even when those complaints are obviously fabricated to serve someone else's interests. Especially then, Davidson said grimly. Men like Crenshaw have lawyers, connections, influence. Fighting them is a good way to lose your job and your reputation. Eleanor felt a surge of anger. So you'll just let him destroy innocent people to protect your position? I'll follow the law, Davidson replied, but his voice lacked conviction. That's all any of us can do. From the workshop came the sound of careful movement, tools being gathered or arranged. Eleanor wondered what Sequoia was actually doing. In there, what plan he might be formulating in the few minutes he'd bought himself. Mrs. Whitmore, Davidson said suddenly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. If you were smart, you'd take whatever money you can get for this place and start over somewhere else. Crenshaw always gets what he wants, and fighting him just makes things worse for everyone involved. Eleanor stared at him. Are you actually advising me to give up? I'm advising you to be practical, Davidson replied. Some battles can't be won, no matter how right you are. Before Eleanor could respond, Coleman emerged from the workshop with Sequoia following behind. The inspector looked frustrated, as if whatever he'd expected to find hadn't materialized. Time to go, Coleman announced. Pulling out the shackles, Sequoia extended his hands without resistance, but as Coleman fitted the iron cuffs around his wrists, he caught Eleanor's eye. For just a moment, he glanced meaningfully toward the workshop, then back to her face. The message was subtle but clear. Whatever he'd done in those 5 minutes, it was important. Mrs. Whitmore, Sequoia said as Coleman secured the chains, thank you for treating me with dignity. Whatever happens next, remember that some things are worth more than money or land. Eleanor felt tears threatening. Sequoia, I'm sorry. I should have been able to protect you from this. You did protect me, he replied. You protected the part of me that matters most, my humanity. That's not something they can take away with chains. Coleman yanked on the shackles, forcing Sequoia toward the horses. Enough conversation. The Cherokee has a schedule to keep. As they loaded Sequoia onto one of the horses, Eleanor felt something break inside her chest. A month ago, she'd been a woman facing impossible odds alone. Sequoia had changed that, had shown her what partnership and mutual respect could accomplish. Now that partnership was being destroyed by the same forces that had driven her to desperation in the first place. Don't give up on the farm, Sequoia called as they prepared to ride away. Remember what we discovered about the land's true potential. Coleman struck him across the shoulder. Silent. But Sequoia's words had been spoken, and Eleanor caught their deeper meaning. Whatever plan he'd been developing, whatever he discovered about the farm's hidden value, he was counting on her to continue the work in his absence. As the three riders disappeared down the road, taking Sequoia toward an uncertain fate, Eleanor stood alone in the farmyard they'd worked so hard to restore. The silence felt oppressive after weeks of shared labor and quiet conversation. For the first time since James's death, she was truly alone again. But as she walked slowly toward the workshop, Eleanor realized that Sequoia had left her something more valuable than tools or equipment. He'd left her with a vision of what the farm could become, and the knowledge that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. With 8 days remaining until foreclosure, Eleanor Whitmore faced the greatest challenge of her life. But she would face it with the strength Sequoia had helped her discover within herself, and with whatever secret weapon he'd prepared during those crucial 5 minutes in the workshop. The real fight was just beginning. Eleanor spent the first day after Sequoia's removal in a state of numb shock, wandering the farm like a ghost haunting her own life. Everything she looked at reminded her of his absence: the perfectly aligned chicken coop, the sturdy barn roof, the workshop that now felt cavernous and empty. But it was on the second day, as she stood in the doorway of that workshop, that she finally understood what Sequoia had been trying to tell her. Hidden beneath his workbench, wrapped in oiled cloth and secured with Cherokee knots she was only beginning to recognize, lay a collection of items that made her breath catch. Detailed drawings of the farm's layout, annotated with measurements and calculations in Sequoia's precise handwriting. A survey map that showed property boundaries she'd never known existed. And most importantly, a leather pouch containing what appeared to be chunks of ordinary rock until she held them up to the light and saw the telltale glint of metal veins running through the stone. Silver ore. Raw, unprocessed, but unmistakably valuable. Eleanor sank into Sequoia's work chair, her hands trembling as she examined the samples. According to his notes, he discovered the silver deposits while clearing fallen trees from the back 40 section of the farm that had been considered worthless scrubland. His Cherokee knowledge of geology and mining, inherited from generations who had worked these mountains before white settlement, had revealed what modern surveyors had missed. Farm wasn't just agricultural land. It was sitting on a silver vein that could be worth hundreds, possibly thousands of dollars. But even as hope flared in Eleanor's chest, reality crashed down around her. She had 6 days until foreclosure. Even if the silver deposits were as valuable as they appeared, there was no way to extract, process, and sell enough ore to meet the bank's deadline. The discovery was tantalizingly close to salvation, but might as well have been on the moon for all the good it could do her now, unless she could convince someone else to see the potential. Eleanor spent the third day studying Sequoia's maps and calculations, trying to understand the full scope of what he'd discovered. His notes indicated that the silver vein ran beneath nearly 15 acres of the farm's back section land that had been considered too rocky and difficult to clear for farming. Land that Marcus Crenshaw probably didn't even know he was trying to acquire. On the fourth day, Eleanor made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. She was going to confront Marcus Crenshaw directly. The Crenshaw textile mill dominated the eastern edge of Millerville like a brick fortress, its tall smokestacks pumping dark clouds into the November sky. Eleanor had never been inside the complex, but as she approached the main office building, she could feel the weight of industrial power that Crenshaw wielded over the entire region. The receptionist, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger with barely concealed disdain. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Crenshaw isn't expecting you." "I'm sure he isn't," Eleanor replied, attempting to project more confidence than she felt. "But I believe he'll want to hear what I have to say about the Whitmore farm." The young man disappeared into the inner office, and Eleanor could hear muffled conversation through the heavy wooden door. When he returned, his expression had shifted from disdain to curiosity. "Mr. Crenshaw will see you now," he said, opening the door to reveal an office that spoke of wealth and authority. Rich mahogany furniture, leather-bound books, and a massive desk that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who stood before it. Marcus Crenshaw himself was smaller than Eleanor had expected, a compact man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He gestured for her to sit in one of the chairs facing his desk, but remained standing himself, a subtle power play that wasn't lost on Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitmore," Crenshaw said, his voice smooth and cultivated, "I must say, this is unexpected. I understood you were dealing with some financial difficulties." "You understand correctly," Eleanor replied. "Which is why I'm here." Crenshaw's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh? I was under the impression that you were determined to fight the bank's entirely reasonable request for debt payment. Has practical wisdom finally prevailed?" Eleanor felt anger flare at his condescending tone, but forced herself to remain calm. "Mr. Crenshaw, I know you've been working to acquire my farm. I know you arranged for the inspection that resulted in Sequoia Henderson's removal. And I know you're planning to turn my land into an extension of your industrial operations. Crenshaw's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Those are serious accusations, Mrs. Whitmore. Do you have any proof of these? Alleged machinations? I don't need proof, Eleanor said. I need to discuss terms. For the first time since she'd entered the office, Crenshaw looked genuinely surprised. He settled into his chair, leaning back and studying her with newfound interest. Terms? He repeated. Are you offering to sell? I'm offering to negotiate, Eleanor said carefully. But first, I want to know exactly what you're planning to do. With my land. Crenshaw was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a detailed map of the region, spreading it across the polished surface. The future, Mrs. Whitmore, he said, pointing to various marked locations. I'm developing an integrated industrial complex that will bring modern manufacturing to this entire valley. Your farm sits at a crucial junction close enough to town. For transportation, with access to both the river and the main road. Eleanor studied the map, noting how her property was marked in red ink, surrounded by other parcels that Crenshaw had apparently already acquired. What about the people who already live here, the other farmers? Progress requires sacrifice, Crenshaw said dismissively. Small farms are inefficient, unsustainable. My operations will provide steady employment for hundreds of workers, bring prosperity to the entire region. Prosperity for who? Eleanor asked. The Cherokee who used to live on this land? The farmers you're displacing? Or just for men like you who profit from other people's losses? Crenshaw's expression hardened. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm a businessman. Not a philosopher. I create value where none existed before. That Cherokee you were harboring, his people had this land for generations and did nothing productive with it. Now it will contribute to the growth of civilization. Eleanor felt her control slipping. Sequoia Henderson knows more about productive land use than you ever will. He showed me things about farming that, showed you? Crenshaw interrupted, leaning forward with sudden interest. What exactly did your Cherokee show you about the land? Too late, Eleanor realized she'd revealed more than she intended. Crenshaw's eyes had sharpened, and she could see his mind working, calculating possibilities she hadn't considered. Nothing of importance, Eleanor said quickly. Just farming techniques. But Crenshaw was already standing, moving to a filing cabinet in the corner of the office. He pulled out a thick folder and began shuffling through documents. Interesting, he said softly. Cherokee were known for their mineral knowledge, weren't they? My grandfather used to employ Cherokee guides when he was prospecting in the mountains. Said they could find ore deposits that white surveyors missed completely. Eleanor's heart began to race. She'd walked directly into a trap of her own making. Mrs. Whitmore, Crenshaw continued, returning to his desk with a surveyor's report in his hand. This document shows that your farm was officially surveyed for mineral rights in 1835. The conclusion was that the land contained no valuable deposits. But if a Cherokee with traditional geological knowledge had access to your property for several weeks, he let the implication hang in the air. Eleanor realized with growing horror that her attempt to leverage Sequoia's discovery had instead revealed it to the one person who could use that knowledge against her. I think, Crenshaw said, his voice taking on a predatory quality, that our negotiation just became much more interesting. Tell me, Mrs. Whitmore, exactly what did your Cherokee discover on your land? Eleanor stood abruptly. I don't know what you're implying, but sit down, Crenshaw commanded, his tone shifting from smooth courtesy to naked authority. You came here to negotiate, so let's negotiate. But understand that I now know you're hiding something valuable, which changes the entire dynamic of our discussion. Eleanor remained standing, her mind racing through options. She could deny everything, claim Sequoia had found nothing of importance. But Crenshaw was clearly too intelligent to be fooled by transparent lies. She could try to leave, but he would simply increase pressure on the bank to foreclose immediately, or she could take the biggest gamble of her life. "You're right," Eleanor said, settling back into her chair. "Sequoia did find something. But before I tell you what it is, I want to know what happened to him. Where was he taken?" Crenshaw smiled, but it was the expression of a shark scenting blood. "The territorial prison in Augusta. Quite primitive conditions, I'm told. Hard labor. Minimal food, no medical care to speak of. Cherokee don't tend to last long under such circumstances." Eleanor felt sick, but forced herself to continue. "I want him released. That's my condition for sharing information about what he found." "Mrs. Whitmore," Crenshaw said, his voice almost pitying, "you're in no position to make demands. You have 6 days until foreclosure, no money to pay your debts, and no legal standing to challenge anything I choose to do. Your Cherokee is the property of the territorial government now. Even if I wanted to secure his release, which I don't, it would take weeks to process the paperwork." Eleanor realized she was trapped. Crenshaw held all the cards: the bank, the legal system, the political connections necessary to destroy or save her. But as she looked at his confident smile, she remembered something Sequoia had told her about his grandfather's philosophy. Sometimes the only way to win against overwhelming power was to change the rules of the game entirely. "Mr. Crenshaw," Eleanor said, her voice growing steadier, "you're assuming I care more about saving my farm than I do about doing what's right. You're assuming I'll sacrifice Sequoia's life to save my own skin. But what if you're wrong?" Something in her tone made Crenshaw's smile falter slightly. "What do you mean?" Eleanor stood again, this time with deliberate purpose. "I mean that some things are worth more than money or land. And I'd rather lose everything than give you one more tool to hurt innocent people." "Mrs. Whitmore," Crenshaw said, his voice taking on a warning edge, "you're making a very foolish decision. I can make your life extremely difficult if you choose to be unreasonable." "You've already made my life difficult," Eleanor replied. "You've stolen my friend, threatened my home, and tried to intimidate me into submission. But what you haven't done is broken my spirit. And you haven't convinced me that your vision of progress is worth the cost in human suffering." Eleanor turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at Crenshaw. "When you foreclose on my farm, when you tear down everything Sequoia and I built together, remember this moment. Remember that you had a chance to choose cooperation over conquest, and you chose conquest. Remember that when your industrial paradise turns this valley into a wasteland." As Eleanor walked toward the office door, Crenshaw's voice followed her, sharp with frustration and threat. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're making an enemy you can't afford to have. This conversation isn't over." Eleanor paused at the door, her hand on the handle. "Yes, Mr. Crenshaw, it is." As she walked out of the textile mill and into the gray November afternoon, Eleanor felt something she hadn't expected, a sense of liberation. She'd faced the most powerful man in the region and refused to be intimidated. She'd chosen principles over pragmatism, even knowing it would probably cost her everything. With 5 days until foreclosure, Eleanor Whitmore had declared war on forces far beyond her ability to defeat. But she'd also discovered something about herself that no one could take away. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined, and some battles were worth fighting even when victory was impossible. The real question now was whether courage alone would be enough to save the people and principles she'd chosen to defend. Eleanor returned from her confrontation with Crenshaw to find an unexpected visitor waiting on her front porch. A woman in traveling clothes sat in the old rocking chair, her posture suggesting both exhaustion and determination. As Eleanor approached, the woman stood and extended her hand. "Mrs. Whitmore, my name is Margaret Thornfield. I'm a journalist from the Charleston Observer. I've been investigating territorial treatment of displaced Cherokee populations, and I believe you have a story I need to hear." Eleanor felt a surge of wariness. How did you know to find me? Margaret smiled, revealing intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Word travels in Cherokee communities, even scattered as they are. A man named Joseph Ridge told me about. A white woman who bought a Cherokee at auction for $1.50, then treated him as an equal partner. That's not a story you hear every day. Eleanor gestured toward the house. Would you like some coffee? It's been a rather difficult day. As they settled in Eleanor's kitchen, Margaret pulled out a leather journal and a pencil. Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to know that I'm not here to write gossip or sensation. I'm documenting systematic injustices for readers who have the power to demand change. But I need to hear your story in your own words. Eleanor found herself telling Margaret everything: the auction, Sequoia's transformation of the farm, the growing partnership between them, the discovery of the silver deposits, and finally his removal by territorial officials. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. This Inspector Coleman, Margaret said when Eleanor finished. Can you describe him in detail? I've been tracking a pattern of suspicious Cherokee relocations, and his name has appeared in several reports. Eleanor provided what details she could remember. Margaret's pencil moved rapidly across her journal pages. Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret said finally, what you're describing isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a systematic campaign to eliminate Cherokee from valuable lands by any means necessary. Men like Crenshaw identify properties with potential value, then use legal mechanisms to remove any Cherokee who might have knowledge of that value. Eleanor felt a chill. You mean Sequoia wasn't taken because of safety concerns? Sequoia Henderson was taken because he discovered something that threatened Marcus Crenshaw's plans, Margaret replied. And unless we act quickly, he'll disappear into the territorial prison system permanently. Eleanor leaned forward. What do you mean, act quickly? Margaret consulted her journal. I've been investigating conditions at the Augusta Territorial Prison. It's a death sentence for most Cherokee sent there. But I also have contacts abolitionists, Cherokee rights advocates, federal officials who are sympathetic to reform. If we can document Sequoia's case properly, we might be able to secure his release. But Crenshaw said the paperwork would take weeks. Crenshaw doesn't know about the federal investigation that's already underway, Margaret interrupted. There's a commission looking into territorial prison conditions, and they have authority to order immediate releases when evidence of illegal detention is presented. Eleanor felt hope stir for the first time in days. What would we need to prove illegal detention? Evidence that Sequoia was removed without proper cause, that his supposed crimes were fabricated, that his detention serves private commercial interests rather than public safety. Margaret looked directly at Eleanor. Testimony from someone willing to swear that his character and conduct were exemplary. Eleanor didn't hesitate. I'll testify. I'll do whatever it takes, Margaret nodded approvingly. There's something else. These silver deposits Sequoia discovered, do you still have his geological samples? Yes, everything is hidden in his workshop. Good, because mineral rights law is complex, and there may be ways to challenge Crenshaw's acquisition of your property. But first, we need to get Sequoia released so he can testify about his discoveries. Over the next 2 days, Margaret worked with the efficiency of someone accustomed to fighting bureaucratic battles. She sent telegrams to federal contacts, arranged meetings with sympathetic officials, and began building a legal case for Sequoia's immediate release. Eleanor provided detailed testimony about his character, his contributions to the farm, and the suspicious timing of his removal. On the 3rd day, a federal marshal arrived at the farm with documents bearing official seals. Eleanor's hands trembled. As she read the court order, Sequoia Henderson was to be released immediately into the custody of federal investigators, pending review of his case. Mrs. Whitmore, the marshal said, we'll need you to accompany us to Augusta to verify identification and provide formal testimony. Are you prepared to travel? Eleanor thought about the farm, about the foreclosure deadline now just 2 days away, about all the practical concerns that should have taken priority. Then she thought about Sequoia, alone in a brutal prison, counting on her to honor the partnership they'd built. I'm ready, she said. The journey to Augusta took most of the day, traveling by coach over rough roads that seemed to stretch endlessly through Georgia's pine forests. Margaret used the travel time to prepare Eleanor for what they might find at the prison, warning her that weeks of hard labor and poor conditions would have taken their toll. Nothing could have prepared Eleanor for the reality. The Augusta Territorial prison was a compound of stone buildings surrounded by high walls topped with iron spikes. The smell hit them first: unwashed bodies, human waste, and the particular odor of hopelessness that seemed to permeate institutions designed to break rather than reform. When they brought Sequoia out to the visiting area, Eleanor barely recognized him. He'd lost significant weight. His face was gaunt and marked with fresh scars, and his clothes were little more than rags. But his eyes, those intelligent, dignified eyes, still held the spark she remembered. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice hoarse from disuse, "you came." "Of course I came," Eleanor replied, fighting back tears. "Did you think I'd abandon you?" Sequoia's smile was tired but genuine. "I hoped. But hope and certainty are different things." Margaret stepped forward with her official documents. "Mr. Henderson, I'm Margaret Thornfield. I'm here with federal authorization to secure your release. You're being transferred to federal custody, pending investigation of your case." Sequoia looked between Margaret and Eleanor, clearly struggling to process this unexpected development. "Released? The charges against you were fabricated," Eleanor explained. "Part of a conspiracy to steal our land. Margaret is a journalist who's been investigating these cases." As the federal marshal completed the release paperwork, Margaret questioned Sequoia about his treatment at the prison. His answers, delivered in careful, controlled language, painted a picture of systematic brutality designed to break Cherokee spirits and discourage any thoughts of resistance or legal challenge. "Mr. Henderson," Margaret said, "I want to publish your story, along with Mrs. Whitmore's. The American public needs to understand what's being done in their name to Cherokee people. Would you be willing to speak publicly about your experiences?" Sequoia looked at Eleanor. "What about the farm? The foreclosure?" Eleanor took his hand, thin now, marked with calluses from prison labor, but still strong. "The farm can wait. Some things are more important than land or money." But Margaret smiled. "Actually, the farm situation may not be as hopeless as you think. I've been researching mineral rights law, and there are some interesting precedents. If Sequoia's geological knowledge led to the discovery of valuable deposits, he may have legal claim to a percentage of those mineral rights under federal Cherokee treaty provisions." Eleanor stared at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Cherokee who discover mineral deposits on land they're forced to leave may retain certain extraction rights under the 1835 Treaty of New Echota. It's a complex legal argument, but one that could potentially nullify Crenshaw's acquisition plans." The journey back to Millerville took on a different character. Instead of defeat and desperation, Eleanor felt something she'd almost forgotten: genuine hope for the future. Sequoia, despite his physical weakness, began sketching new plans for the farm, incorporating both agricultural development and sustainable mineral extraction. "We could build something unprecedented," he said, his voice growing stronger with each mile. "A working farm that also supports Cherokee families displaced by removal. Use the silver revenues to purchase land. Create a community where Cherokee knowledge and skills are valued." Eleanor watched him transform before her eyes, the spark of purpose driving away the shadows of his imprisonment. "You're talking about more than just saving my farm." "I'm talking about building something that matters," Sequoia replied. "Something that proves Cherokee people don't just survive, we contribute, we create, we build futures worth having." They reached the farm on November 30th, the day before foreclosure was scheduled to proceed. Eleanor half expected to find officials already posted on the property, but instead they discovered a small crowd gathered in the farmyard. Margaret's contacts, federal investigators, and several Cherokee families who had somehow learned of their return. Margaret wasted no time in organizing what she called a public documentation session. With federal officials as witnesses, she interviewed Eleanor and Sequoia about their partnership, the farm's transformation, the silver discovery, and the conspiracy that had led to his illegal imprisonment. Mrs. Whitmore, one of the federal investigators, asked, "Are you prepared to enter into a formal partnership agreement with Mr. Henderson for development of this property?" Eleanor looked at Sequoia, seeing not the chained prisoner she'd bought at auction, but the skilled craftsman, the knowledgeable farmer, the friend who had restored her faith in human dignity. "More than prepared," she said. "It's the only arrangement." "That makes sense." The formal partnership documents were signed that evening by lamplight in Eleanor's kitchen. Under federal oversight, they established the Whitmore-Henderson Agricultural and Mining Cooperative, a legal entity that protected both Eleanor's property rights and Sequoia's mineral discovery claims under Cherokee Treaty provisions. When Harrison Blackwood arrived the next morning with foreclosure papers, he found federal marshals posted at the farm's entrance and a team of federal investigators examining his bank's records for evidence of conspiracy with Marcus Crenshaw. "Mrs. Whitmore," Blackwood said, his usual confidence notably absent, "there seems to be some confusion about the status of your debt." "No confusion at all," Eleanor replied, standing beside Sequoia on the front porch they'd built together. "The debt will be paid in full from our initial silver extraction revenues. The Federal Mining Commission has expedited our permits given the legal issues surrounding this case." Margaret Thornfield's articles appeared in newspapers across the country over the following weeks, telling the story of a broke widow who bid $1.50 for a chained Cherokee man and discovered not just silver, but the true meaning of partnership and dignity. The story captured public imagination precisely because it contradicted everything people believed about racial relationships in the territorial period. But for Eleanor and Sequoia, the real transformation was quieter and more personal. As winter settled over their farm now, legally and morally, they worked together to build something unprecedented. A place where Cherokee families could find safety and opportunity. A working model of cooperation that proved different peoples could create prosperity together. The small cabin Eleanor had inherited became the seat of something much larger. By spring, they had constructed additional buildings to house Cherokee families displaced by removal. The silver extraction, managed with Cherokee knowledge of sustainable mining, provided revenue to purchase adjacent properties and expand their cooperative community. One evening in late March, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over fields planted with both traditional Cherokee crops and new agricultural innovations, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever think about that day at the auction?" she asked Sequoia. "What would have happened if I hadn't bid?" Sequoia was quiet for a moment, his hands working on a new carving, not a bird this time, but a small house with Cherokee and European architectural elements combined. "I think," he said finally, "that some things are meant to happen. Not because of fate or destiny, but because sometimes people make choices that create the future they need." Eleanor nodded, understanding. She'd bid $1.50 for a chained man, thinking she was solving an immediate crisis. Instead, she discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or acres, but in the relationships built on mutual respect and shared purpose. As stars appeared in the darkening sky above their thriving community, Eleanor Whitmore and Sequoia Henderson continued planning for tomorrow, not as owner and property, not as benefactor and recipient, but as partners in the ongoing work of building a world where dignity and opportunity belonged to everyone. The palace they built together wasn't made of marble or gold. It was constructed from something far more valuable, the revolutionary idea that people of different backgrounds could create something better together than either could achieve alone. And in a world too often defined by division and exploitation, that palace stood as proof that another way was possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.